Well, good morning, everybody, on this very blustery day. I'm calling you this morning from Gloucestershire, just on the edge of the red zone. I've got everything battened down. The only thing that can get between us is a loss of power. Not a lot I can do about that, but we'll keep everything crossed as we go along this morning. When I looked on the system earlier this morning, we're expecting 41 people. Currently, we've got 22, so I'm expecting a few more people to join the workshop. As they do that, I will let them in. I'd just like to point out to you that this session is being recorded, so hopefully that will be fine with everybody. And I know that Charlie and his colleagues at IFAC will make the recording available onto the BAT system or similar for any of your colleagues who, due to the inclement weather, weren't able to actually dial in. Maybe they've lost power or whatever, or any other colleagues who want to take advantage of this session on complaints. So we'll be together this morning for about an hour looking through complaints. I'm sure for a lot of you it will be a refresher. As I say, without any further ado, let me start to share my screen and we can get underway. Here we go. Okay, so what we're going to talk about this morning, as you know, is complaints handling. And what we'll do is just take a quick look at what we're looking to get out of our time together this morning. So here's the learning objectives. We're going to take a quick look at the difference between complaints and things that wouldn't constitute a complaint, probably something that's more minor, maybe more administrative or something like that. And we'll just unpack that a little bit. We'll take a more detailed look at the parties involved when people make complaints, including the Financial Ombudsman Service. Again, a refresher for the vast majority on the call in terms of what we need to do in terms of having a procedure in place to handle complaints. There are some do's and don'ts, and some expectations indeed from the likes of the FCA and the Financial Ombudsman Service. We'll take a look at what the potential outcomes of a complaint could be. It won't always be kind of the dreaded FOSS, letting people in, FOSS ruling. And then for those of you who are going to take responsibility for administrative complaints as the complaint handlers at the firm, there is an exam that you're required to pass. Now, I did the exam myself yesterday evening. I'm absolutely confident that everything that you need to know and understand to be successful in that exam, we will actually be covering this morning. So, even our regulator, the FCA, knows that when we're working in an advisory business, it's kind of a contact sport. And like any retail business, client dissatisfaction is inevitable. So they're not sitting in an ivory tower particularly. They know that whenever we have interactions with people, then ultimately there is potential there for some sort of dissatisfaction to arise. And unfortunately, more and more, we're becoming quite Americanized in this respect, that people are very quick to complain. They're very quick to look for some sort of compensation. So we're living in a kind of a claims culture these days, which means that unfortunately, we have to look at every client as a potential complainant, irrespective of how long they've actually been a client of ours. And I know at this stage, some of you are going to say, no, Jeremy, you're talking rubbish. That's never going to happen. I've got clients who've been in my business with me for the last 15, 20 years. We're friends as well as advisor and client, and that will never happen. So what I've got is I've got some stats actually from the Financial Ombudsman Service that I'm going to be taking you through as part of this workshop, just for your background, context and information. And you'll see actually long-standing clients do have the same kind of propensity to complain as clients you're onboarding for the first time. So that's why we need to be aware of that. And every interaction these days is a potential source of complaint, particularly if expectations aren't managed in the right way. And unfortunately, just to pour kind of oil on the fires there are a number of firms who actively make a living these days, chasing people, encouraging them to make complaints about missed sales. We saw that for the first time, I guess, in any great scale with PPI complaints, but those firms are continuing. They're obviously making good money because they're still able to advertise in media to try and get clients to join them in chasing down compensation payments. So as I said, as part of the learning objectives, you are required, everybody working within financial services must be aware of the complaints process. So again, well done for coming on to this workshop, because that will enable you to evidence that in your fit and proper report for the regulator, your annual MO2. So well done for that. And as I said, all firms must have a complaints handler. And I'm very aware that probably the majority of you on this call will be fulfilling that type of role. So for you, this is probably a refresher. For anybody who's coming new into the role, well, there'll be some good information for you here. As I say, we're working towards making sure you're going to be very successful in that multi-choice exam that you need to take as part of your role requirements in that respect. Okay, Paul, yeah, thanks for that. You're correct in what you say in your chat room there. So, as I said, not all complaints actually or expressions of dissatisfaction, to be more accurate, turn into complaints. So what we're going to do is to just have a look at that in a bit more detail. There's no hard and fast rule on this. And once again, to satisfy myself, I went onto the FCA website yesterday and had a look at the rule book around complaints. And in usual kind of FCA style, they talk about judgment and discretion. So when somebody expresses dissatisfaction, you'll have to make a decision on it. If it's not too serious, it could be that you can handle it in a slightly different way, and it can be labelled more as a circumstance rather than a complaint. So as you know, if a complaint can be resolved anyway within 3 days, it doesn't, strictly speaking, have to enter the formal complaints process, which is good. And typically these types of complaints are going to be quite minor, aren't they? They're going to be sort of minor admin or servicing issues that you or your colleagues can sort very quickly for them. Yeah, so anything that's kind of more minor doesn't have to be entered onto the complaints register. You could regard it as less serious and treat it as a circumstance. And indeed, as I say to you, I've got lots of friends who are IFAs. And you know, inevitably things do go wrong. It's just a fact of life. It's not always, you know, our fault as advisors. You know, providers are very good at making mistakes that our clients are on the end of, and they look to us to help them put things right. So some clients are just actually seeking an apology. We just want somebody to say they're sorry. They're not actually in it for formal redress. And sometimes we can kind of make the problem go away, really, if we just pay some compensation. And compensation doesn't always need to be money. I mean, again, as I say, with my work with advisors, I know that sometimes where things have gone wrong, they've maybe sent a bottle or some chocolates or some flowers or all of the above to client and partner. And that's kind of an expression of kind of regret and apology. And that's made the issue kind of go away. And that's really, you know, what most people are looking for. If there's an issue, can you resolve it? Can you resolve it quickly? And do they feel they've been treated fairly in that regard? If you are have exercised your judgment and you feel that it doesn't need to be escalated to a formal complaint, then the kind of best practice recommendation here is to deal with it as if it is. So give it the same urgency, give it the same attention to detail as you would. The game in town here, the overall objective is to stop something that's relatively minor escalating into a more formal complaint, and then you're into the whole formal complaints process. Even if it's only a relatively minor issue there, if you've got any inkling that that may well escalate into something that's more formal, at that stage, it's very good practice to keep your PI provider informed. Won't affect how they kind of rate you for your premium next year. It's just good practice to put it on their radar. Now, I'm a veteran of working for 3 big insurance companies. Each of them had a general arm. I can say this now, I'm not working for them. You know, they're very good at looking for reasons not to pay. So the more information, the more you can keep them updated with what's happening, the more likely it is that any claims will be successful. So as part of the learning objectives, what we said is not every expression of dissatisfaction is a complaint. And that's what we mean when we looked at this slide here. Minor incidents that you've exercised your judgment and discretion on, and you said, this isn't actually a formal complaint, it's relatively minor, we can get that sorted out, it's more of a circumstance. Which leads us on then to what will actually constitute a complaint. So again, that's a definition that I've lifted direct from the FCA. As you can see, it's very kind of broad and far-reaching. So they regard a complaint as any expression of dissatisfaction that warrants a specific response. Yeah. Now, as you know, where you've got a client and they want to raise a complaint, then in the first instance, they must direct their initial complaint to you as their advisory firm. Now, from time to time, because relationships are broken down, clients do try and go elsewhere to complain. And the FOST certainly do get clients to approach them directly with complaints. But in this regard, the FOST, the Ombudsman Service, are very good. They always refer the complainant, the complaint, back to their advisory firm in the first instance, because that is actually the process that they have to follow. In terms of why people might complain, well, you know these reasons as well as I do. A whole variety of, they feel they've not had the right information, the correct information. They probably have, but they don't understand it. And when I work on complaints, it may be that the time and trouble hasn't been taken to fully explain to the client exactly what it is they're getting into and what they've got in terms of the proposition. Building on that, they may feel that they've received poor advice. It's funny how they always think they've received poor advice, maybe when the stock market's coming down, not when it's going up, in my experience. That the marketing material in some way was misleading. Now, providers are getting much better with marketing material, but there's still an element, despite TCF and vulnerable customers and all that good stuff around GDPR, where there's still an element of small print. Could be that there's fraud involved. It could be that, just looking people in, they feel that their personal data has been compromised or misused in some way. So there's a whole different training workshop on PID and GDPR, all that kind of good stuff, a whole raft of stuff we need to do. But focusing on complaints, when we receive a complaint, then as we've already said, that needs to go to the complaints handler. And as you know, it's part of the process that we have when we're advising clients. They actually have already been told who the complaints handler is, who deals with complaints within the firm. So as part of the client agreement form, we actually specify to the client what they need to do if they have a complaint. And the other thing at this stage, and as I've said, I've got lots of friends who are IFAs, that we need to make sure that the client is actually complaining about you or about the provider, because it's about 50-50. As I say, I've worked for a number of providers, and they are very good at getting things wrong, particularly putting new business on risk and missing things like direct debit collections and that kind of thing, or documents going astray or not being actioned. So it's key critical that at the very early stages of a complaint, you are crystal clear on what the client is complaining about and why, because it may be not your firm that's kind of in the hot water here. It could be a provider. And I know lots of IFAs who actually join forces with their clients to actually make complaints to the provider in terms of kind of the service that the client has been experiencing that's caused them to be dissatisfied and to raise a formal complaint. In terms of who can make a complaint, well, you may think that it's fair that only the complainant can actually make the complaint. If only life was so simple. The regulator is very clear about this, and they've said basically any family member of the complainant can do that. Could be just a personal friend of theirs. Could be that they've gone to their MP. They're so incensed, and the MP can actually make a complaint on their behalf. And again, in provider land, that's a tactic that some clients use very successfully, because providers tend to jump higher and faster if they get an MP's letter. Or from the Citizens Advice Bureau, they do a great job from a consumer point of view. So basically, when you think about complaints, if asked the question, who can make a complaint? Well, anybody can really. It does not have to be the complainant. And the other thing, and it's increasingly important these days, that complaint doesn't have to be in writing. It could be made orally, or it could indeed be made over social media. And that's an increasing trend these days. Now, I've been in financial services over 30 years, and I can remember the days where if anybody was dissatisfied, the very first thing we used to say to them was, well, you'll have to put that in writing before we can even consider your complaint. Those days are long gone, probably quite rightly. I would imagine that within a few years, the amount of complaints that are made via social media will far outweigh even people picking up the telephone to make a complaint, let alone put it in an email or write a letter. Now, I said that I'd share some data with you because, it's easy. I'm sure you don't get any complaints in your firm, but complaints are alive and well. And you'll see from this data here that I got from the FOSS, the most recent data for the full year last year, is actually the number of complaints went up relatively significantly. About financial advisors went up by over 1,000 from 1920 to 2021. So not far short of 3,000 complaints were made against financial advisors. As a proportion of all complaints, it actually increased as well. So it was less than 1% 1920. It's gone up to around about 1%. And this is what I was banging on about earlier when I said, when I talk to people as part of my consultancy business and they say, I'll never get complaints against me from existing clients. Well, somebody's getting complaints, because 13% of the overall complaints that were made about financial advisors, 13%, not an insignificant number, were about events that happened more than 15 years ago. So just because you've got a long-standing client and you're enjoying what you think is a good relationship with them, when the wheel falls off the bike, because of what I've said about this propensity these days to have a compensation and claims culture, then people are more inclined to actually complain. So don't have any sense of complacency around that, because the data doesn't actually support that. The good news for your sector in particular was that the number of complaints and the uphold rates were lower for IFAs than in the previous year. So great work there, obviously doing something right. I thought you'd also may be quite interested to see what the most complained about products are. Apologies if you've already been on the website for your own kind of research and look this up. But what struck me here once again is that, you know, the pensions issue is alive and well. What surprised me is that the number of complaints around SIPs was higher than occupational pension transfers, because all the noise in the pink press is around occupational pension transfers. But the number of complaints about SIPs, and that actually quite surprised me. You know, 47% of those complaints were actually upheld. Even personal pensions, you know, a relatively high number of complaints, but less of an uphold rate. Yeah, and then stocks and shares ISAs kind of sandwiched between the two. So that's what the products people were complaining about. And then I thought I'd just have a look at why people were complaining. If those were the products, why were they complaining? And as usual, this one's normally the top. Some kind of, you know, this advice wasn't suitable for me. Now, again, drilling down into some of the commentary from the Ombudsman service, this isn't necessarily that it was the wrong advice at the time. This is where the advisor can't evidence why that advice was given sufficiently for the FOS to make a ruling. And I know this is something that IFAC work with you on. You know, there's no rule of audit. If it's not written down, it doesn't exist. There must be an audit trail, and nothing is more certain than the land of complaints, really. So this is the frustration. I know when you're in an advisory role, maybe it was the right advice, the most suitable advice, but if your documentation hasn't been impeccable, then anybody can find holes in it. You know, when I do file checks, it's easy to find holes in other people's work if they've not been meticulous and thorough. It's not all about advisors. As you can see, the second most complained about issue that was upheld was administration or customer service. So for some reason, the wheels come off on the servicing piece, whether it's upfront client acquisition or ongoing servicing and administration. Yeah, and remember, this is about advisors specifically, not providers. So this is where something in our office has not fired on all cylinders, not gone as well as it could be. So even though complaints are down, and even though I'm confident that you have a very, very low level of complaints, then people are complaining, and the number of complaints has increased year on year. In terms of who can be involved in a complaint, well, for you, this is really just a refresher, really. So you'd expect the two parties we've got on screen there, somebody who's actually making a complaint, and your good self sitting in the authorised firm there. They're the main two parties. And, you know, 9 times out of 10, that can all be resolved, all tickety-boo. You do your investigation, it gets resolved, and everybody's happy, you know. And, you know, there's a satisfied client who's complained and had their complaint resolved is 6 times more likely to take another product from you, and 6 times more likely to recommend your services to other people as well. So there can be some good upside in effective and efficient complaint handling. You can actually turn people around and make them advocates for your business. Where that isn't possible, where they feel the client still feels aggrieved, feels dissatisfied, and feels that you've not resolved the issue, or you've looked at it and gone, you know what, there's nothing to resolve here, so you go back to the complainant on that basis. As you know, they do have a right of recourse beyond that, and that goes to the financial ombudsman. I'm not going to say too much more about the ombudsman at this stage, because I've got quite a number of slides where we will go on and unpack that in terms of what their role and responsibilities are and what some of their expectations are as well, just as a refresh for you. But I did say there were 4 parties involved in this. So a lot of people think, well, that's as far as it will go. But actually, there is a further element of redress, which is the civil court. Now, as you probably know, the only party who can actually go to the civil court is the complainant. So this will be a situation where they've followed the complaints process through yourself in the firm. For whatever reason, that's not been resolved, and then they've put their formal complaint into the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman has made a ruling, and still, for whatever reason, that complainant is not satisfied with the outcome from the Ombudsman. They have a further opportunity to pursue that through the civil court. Yeah. So whilst the Ombudsman's decision is always binding on the authorised firm, it is not binding on the complainant. The complainant can actually utilise the court service. By taking that option up, though, the complainant actually loses the Ombudsman's ruling. So they're now going to be in the hands of the civil court. You, sitting in the firm, unfortunately, you do not have that recourse. You cannot take the decision to the civil court. It doesn't matter how unhappy you are with what the Ombudsman may or may not have said and what they've ruled, you haven't got that recourse. There's only one place you can go as an authorised firm if you're not happy, and that's way beyond that. That's to a judicial review. And as you know, from those of you who look at the court system, a judicial review has to be on point of law. It goes without saying, building on that point around the considerations, that throughout the process, you should always keep your PI provider informed. So I've got a question coming in from the chat, which is a great question. And if anybody does know the answer to that, I'd be absolutely delighted to hear it, because I've actually been trying to find that answer out myself. So as I say, I do a lot of work with advisors and providers. And I'm trying to find a case where somebody has gone to the civil court over and above the Ombudsman. And I've spoken to dozens of firms and providers, trying to find it through research, and I can't find it. I suspect the reason is because it's probably a big fat zero. People don't go beyond that. But I'd be delighted to be proved wrong, and I'd be delighted if somebody could, if you do know, let me know so I can start to share that information with other people. So those are the parties involved. In terms of actually the process, as I've said, people can complain in any way they like these days. So social media, email, whatever, and it all need to be treated with yeah, thank you. All need to be treated with equal status and in the same way. So no one gets preference over the other, no one method. In terms of actually the process, is the 4-step process, and I'm going to just put them out there, and then we're going to go through them one by one and unpack them. So the first thing we need to do, if we get an incoming complaint, however it comes in, is we must acknowledge receipt of that complaint, and then we must acknowledge it back to the client. So we have a formal process in place in terms of receipt, we acknowledge it back to the client. We then need to do an investigation. So this will typically be the complaints handler who lifts the bonnet on the whole thing and does an investigation using the resources and talking to the people who are involved. And then it all culminates to us putting together a final response to the clients. In terms of a time frame for that, then we're looking at an 8-week time frame to get that done. And 8 weeks is a very good figure to have in your mind if you're going to be doing the test later this morning or at some other time. 8 weeks, worth writing down, worth committing to memory. I'm sure it's probably seared into your brain anyway. I think we all know the 8-week rule. So when a complaint is received, what we need to do is to make sure that immediately, without any unnecessary delay, it goes off to that the complaints handler within the firm. Now, as I've said, these days it could be a verbal complaint. People are much more likely to pick up the phone if they're unhappy, or send something in via social media. Whenever we get a complaint verbally, we've got to make sure that everything is recorded on the client file, and we've got to make sure that a note is put on the file, that it's signed and dated. And that's certainly something that the Ombudsman will be looking for if it progresses to that. So don't sort of trip up at the first hurdle. In terms of what sorts of information needs to be recorded, well, certainly the date and time, and also the duration of the call as well, because again, that helps give an indication about how detailed that call was and what sort of information people will be expecting to see there. Was it a half-an-hour call versus a 2-minute call, versus the amount of information that's been put onto the file. You should have this on file already, but it may be worth referring to where that information can be found. So contact details, basically, of the client. Remember, it may not necessarily be the client who's making the complaint. We've said anybody can make a complaint. So best practice for me, if I was handling a complaint, would be make sure I have the contact details of everybody, both the complainant and the complainer, if that is different. We also need to capture details of the advisor or advisors concerned for obvious reasons, and what the complaint is all about. This is coming back to my previous point, really. So really drill in at this stage, use your questioning skills to understand exactly what it is they're complaining about. Is it the firm? Is it something else? Okay, thanks, Charlie. If you've got any specific case law on that, Charlie, that'd be great to see. And then in terms of an acknowledgement, well, when I'm working with firms, and I'm sure this is what you do, most firms, if a complaint comes in, they treat it with absolute priority. I mean, you must respond to a complaint in writing within 8 weeks. I would suggest that the claims handlers these days, they normally acknowledge receipt the same day, soon as possible, and they send out a letter, and it really just says, right, this is what we think you're complaining about. Okay, this is how we're going to keep in contact with you. This is when we think we'll get in contact with you again, and this is how contact will be made. And typically, that will be in writing. Well, you might reserve the writing there to say, if we've got any queries, we might just want to give you a call, if that's okay, just to clarify any issues with you. The other thing to remember here, particularly, if they're due an annual review or something like that, is that any client contact during this complaint process has to be pre-approved by the complaint handler. So don't feel tempted to pick up the phone yourself to try and smooth over the waters without having got pre-approval by the complaints handler and having that documented on the file as well. Yeah, as I say, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. Yeah, so good question there from Terry. If the complainant isn't the client, then you've got to establish a relationship and make sure that the complainant has given them permission and authority to act on their behalf. Okay. In terms of the next stage of the process, you're moving into sort of your Sherlock Holmes mode here. You're going to get out your magnifying glass and do some investigation. This is where the complaint handler really starts to get out the file, starts to get out the paperwork, and does a thorough, balanced, objective investigation. And as you know, in your role as complaint handler here, what you're trying to do is mimic everything that you believe the FOSS would do because, you know, if it does go to the next level, this is the very bare minimum the Ombudsman will be looking for. So the sorts of areas that you need to take into account is, have there been any previous complaints against this particular advisor or advisors? Is this something that's starting to emerge as a trend? So if we were to take a trend that's emerged over recent times, that would be the transfer of occupational pension schemes, and maybe people complaining about that. So the complaints handler is in a good position to get an early warning, along with the compliance officer here, about any trends that might be coming out as to dissatisfaction with what's happened. And then it's a case of really looking at what the complainant is saying and what is documented within the client file. And this is what I was saying in my previous comments, really. You know, the client file is absolutely the oracle of everything, every client interaction, what's been discussed, what's been provided, what the client said, what you said, so that they can compare and contrast between the two. And the critical document here would be the suitability report, for obvious reasons. This is why we're doing what we do. I'd say in conjunction with that would be the, you know, the nailing down, really, of the client's attitude to risk. Certainly that's something that came out when I was reading the Ombudsman report about still being uncertainty around compliance, appetite for risk and capacity for loss. Not that the conversations weren't being had, I don't believe that for 1 minute. I'm sure very thorough conversations I had wasn't adequately documented on the file. So I know, like a broken record, it is all about the client file and what's recorded on that. So the maximum amount of time prescribed by the FCA for investigating complaints is 2 months. So the 8-week deadline is not finite, because you could require information from a third party, a provider, fund manager, and they're struggling to turn it around within the requisite time frame. Now, don't let that throw you when you're looking at potential questions in a potential test you might be taking. 8 weeks is still a good number to have in your head. Just remember that one twiddly bit, yeah? Sometimes it's not possible because information is provided. However, at that point, if you can't resolve it within 8 weeks, and the complaints handler does have to go back to the complainant, update them on the current situation, and indicate when the case is likely to be resolved. At that point, you do also have to give them a leaflet about being able to complain to the Ombudsman service and contact services. Yeah. Okay, thanks. So as I said, even if you've not resolved it at that point, they do have the right to take it. So, you know, remember that clock is ticking. Get on with it. No reason to drag your feet. That's something the Ombudsman will be looking at anyway. When the investigation is complete, as you know, you do have to send out that formal letter of response to the client. Yeah, and there are different ways to skin a cat here in terms of resolving the complaint. Could be that you decide that this in some way warrants some sort of financial compensation. It's not always money. Could be that you just want to say, we're sorry, and give them a written apology. Could be that you need to do something on the admin side. So wheels dropped off from an administrative point of view. You can remediate that and sort that out. Might be a verbal apology. It could be a mixture of those things. Doesn't have to be that thing. So, according to the Ombudsman service, final response should include the following. So what they'll be looking for, if it goes to them, is the fact that the complaint has been summarised in some way, shape or form. And what they've said is, you know, if you've made a mistake, then to acknowledge it. Don't try and be too defensive. You know, if you said right at the start of this workshop, I think realistically people know that things are going to happen. Mistakes are going to be made. Yeah. Give details of whether you accept the complaint and what you want to offer in terms of redress. Yeah. So if you don't accept the complaint, say we don't accept it, and this is why we don't accept it. So that's why we've decided one way or t'other. Let's be very clear. Let's spell it out in the most simple terms that we can. Yeah, no, this is why. Yeah. At this stage, again, the complainant has the right to know that they can take their complaint on to the Ombudsman, and you have to give contact details to the Ombudsman, provide them with that leaflet, and let them know that they have a time frame of 6 months to get to the Ombudsman from when they receive your final response. In this letter as well, it would be worth indicating, because if you don't, you're going to be asked by FOS anyway, whether or not you're happy to waive the relevant time limits. So, you know, why somebody would want to sit on a complaint for longer than 6 months, I don't know. But in the unlikely event that they did, the FOS can only consider it if you give them permission to waive the relevant time limits. And as I say there, always include a link to their website and a copy of their leaflet. So a complaint is considered closed when that final response letter has been issued and compensation is paid, accepted and processed. Yeah. So it's not just good enough to send out a letter. Yeah, if you've offered some sort of redress on that by way of compensation, then the client needs to come back and say, yeah, thank you very much, that will do it. Out goes the payment, and at that stage, once you see that that's been processed, everything's fine. You can close it off, and you can do what you've been wanting to do all along: update the complaints register to record the outcome that you've successfully dealt with it. And at that stage, always send a copy of the formal letter to your PI insurers, not because you're going to make a claim, just again, keeping them in the loop in terms of everything that's happening as we're going along here. Now, that's the outcome we all want. I understand that, but sometimes that's not always going to be the outcome. So if for whatever reason the complainant feels that they want to take it on to the next step because they're still dissatisfied, then that's when they get the Ombudsman service involved. So let's have a look at the process that the Ombudsman would actually go through if the client makes contact with them. So as I said right at the start there, they're not even going to take on the complaint or look at it until the complainant, the client, has had a final response letter from the firm. So they can't go through the back door to the Ombudsman. You've got to go through your complaints process first. And the FOS will take that final response letter really as the starting point of their investigations. And that's why I say it's good to have everything documented in that, because it shows, you know, very good due diligence from your point of view, and almost gets you off to a good start, if you like, with the Ombudsman in terms of the thoroughness of your final response letter, including whether or not you'd waive those timeframes. So the more thorough your final response is, the better initial sentiment you'll get from the Ombudsman. As you know, when a complaint goes to the Ombudsman, their aim is to get resolution within 3 months. Now, that's their aim. In real life, that isn't always possible. They actually are running behind due to the level of complaints they're receiving. And they'll accept complaints from a wide range of representatives on behalf of complainants. We've seen that already. and they want to ensure it's a very simple process for complaints to be registered. And I had a look at that, and you just have to go on their website basically and register. Really, really straightforward. So, you know, they want people they want to make it easy for people to raise concerns. And as you know, they'll look at complaints from a wide range of areas, all the areas that we're used to dealing in. The one thing to remember when we're looking in the pension side of the business, then they will not actually consider complaints from occupational pension schemes, because OPSs have got their own different form of oversight, regulation and complaints. But certainly for SIPs, annuities and that kind of thing, then they do fall under the scope of FOSS. In terms of what their actual powers are, well, you know, quite far-reaching as it happens. Let's have a look at that. They can make a firm apologise. They can make a firm explain its actions, and the biggie is they can make a firm offer compensation to the complainant. Now we'll look at the levels of compensation that they can be made to offer at the minute. The thing to remember here is that unlike the FCA, they can't actually impose fines on firms for their conduct. So whilst they can offer compensation that has to be paid, don't confuse that with being a fine. It's not a fine, it's compensation. They don't actually have the statutory power to impose fines. When they receive a complaint, the first thing they do is they say, right, we've got your final response letter, hopefully. Now let's have a look, please, at the client file. And that's why I kept banging on earlier about how important the client file is. And I'm sure you all understand that, because that's what they're going to base their assessment on the information and evidence provided within the client file. So, you know, if it's not evidence within the file, they can't see it, they can't make any decisions on it. Yeah. However, having said that, they will be very fair, balanced, and they'll make an objective. You know, they're not there on behalf of the client or behalf of you as the firm. Their role is actually to be objective and independent, but they can only do that, like any auditor, based on the information they're provided with. And they'll just do what anybody does when they're doing a file check, really. So you're probably used to this as part of the compliance services that you receive from IFAC, and they do the file checks. The bottom line is, point of time the advice was given, have we got evidence on the file that that advice was appropriate for the client? You know, they'll contact the client directly, and they'll ask the client, you know, what's your recollection of what happened? What records did you keep over and above what you're provided with, including what the advisor might have provided you with? You know, what were the features of the investment? Let's have a look at all information and evidence on the file. May not just be from that particular sale or advice. It could be from historical or subsequent ones, just to see how that all knits together. What's been provided about the underlying assets that you may have invested the client in. This is an interesting one in terms of what was actually the regulations in force and law in force at the time. Because, you know, things, and we know this in our industry, don't we? Things change all the time. So it's very pertinent as to what was happening right there, right then. And as I said earlier, the decision is binding on the firm. So once we're in the process of being at the Ombudsman, once they make a ruling, then as the advisory firm, you have to get on and make that happen. As we said, that complainant does have recourse to the court. Whenever you're asked to provide something for the Ombudsman service, then again, good practice here, keeping your PI provider informed and up to date. Send them a copy of the report over and above that final response letter when you're asked to provide information to them, so that they're not blindsided. They've got good information. In terms of the FOSS themselves, as you probably know, they were established, like a lot of things, back in the year 2000 by the Financial Service and Marketing Act. As you know, they're responsible to the FCA. So whilst they don't impose fines directly, they will notify the FCA where they've made a judgment against a firm. Then it's up to the FCA then if they want to take any further action. Where a complainant goes, yeah, okay, thank you for your decision, FOSS, I agree with that, then immediately it becomes legally binding on both parties. Yeah. As I've already said, if the complainant doesn't want to accept the decision, they can go to the court, but they'll lose that FOSS ruling. Yeah. No right of appeal if you're a firm, just that judicial review that I already talked about. In terms of who can go to the FOSS, so it's again a wide range. So you'd expect to see consumers on there. It's this wonderful phrase called micro enterprise or micro enterprises. That's quite it's an Americanism, I think. It's just small businesses, as you can see there, as an entity. You've got less than 10 employees or less than 10 million quid worth of turnover, you can go. And small businesses as well. Now, why the FOSS choose to differentiate between micro enterprises and small businesses? That's a new one on me. We thought they would just try and keep it simple. Or any charities with an annual income of less than 6.5 million. So it's a very broad, so big companies can't, but smaller companies and individuals can. And I think you'll be very familiar with these timeframes. We've already covered the 6.
Yeah, I think we've lost Jeremy there. Can you all hear me talking? Maybe you could put something in the chat or.
Yes, Charlie.
Yes.
Well done. Okay, so well, we can wait for Jeremy to come back. I'm not sure how he comes back that easily. He has to let himself in, so to speak, into the meeting. What I could do is just take you into that. Should be an exam for complaints, and which would sort of firm up any. So I'm just looking for that now, and that will enable us to give you a certificate, so to speak. So there's an exam in back called Complaints and the FOSS 2022. So that's somewhere to go. After this seminar is finished, we upload the recording of this seminar and put it onto BAT. So you'll see it there and be able to take the exam there. I shouldn't imagine it's a especially challenging exam, but it's there, the material's there, and it proves that you've done the required training. Certainly to be an SMF 16 compliance director of a firm employing more than one RI, I'd say it's mandatory requirement. So that's one place to go. I could invite questions from anyone. I think we lost Jeremy on the point of challenging the FOS, Just before we come on to questions, I'll just say there is a way that IFAs and the retail industry can challenge the FOS. I think it's filling out a form N184 from memory, but you challenge it through the High Court. And in the examples that I've personally done, the FOS just immediately take it back, say, oh, we'll have another look at it in that case, if you're going to challenge it, rather than show up in the High Court. If they do show up in the High Court, there is a risk that you could be sued for their costs. So that's that. And obviously the customer has a right to take it to the court if they don't agree. Although the courts are highly unlikely, as I put in the chat box, to overturn what the FOS have said.
I popped a little.
Does anyone want to ask me a question, or I think some other staff from IFAC are on the call. Kirsty probably knows more than me, but does anyone want to ask me?
Yeah, Charlie, I did put a little question up there just as we were losing signal. So if FOS have rejected a complaint, they give 7 days for the complainant to ask for another ombudsman. So if the complainant doesn't come back, then the FOS send us a message saying they've not upheld it and they've closed the file. And then they say that if the complainant comes back and asks, they may open it again. But have they got a time limit for that?
Well, yes, there is a time limit, and you need to be aware of it. I didn't think it was 7 days. I think it's more like 6 months from memory.
Well, the initial, we're not upheld it for these reasons. Here's our determination. If you want another ombudsman to look at it, let us know by. And it's
that's another ombudsman to look at it. But there's if you disagree with our decision. So if you don't disagree with their decision within the period they put on their letter, no, you're done for. And if you come back a year later, they won't look at it. So it's a really important.
It's the complainant, not us. The complainant.
Correct.
Yeah, good. So that's one done.
There's another point which is sort of worth just talking around, which is because claims is the activity of being a claims manager is a regulated activity. It's slightly edgy as for an IFA to help their customer bring a complaint to the FOS, I suppose, if you see what I mean. On the one hand, if you take on a new customer, it's almost a free shot to get a review on everything they've ever done just by getting them to stick in a complaint to the FOS about their previous advisor. But if you obviously can't take a cut of any any compensation.
We don't do that.
And you just need to be a little bit careful.
He's not allowed to do that, Charlie.
And you need to be careful that you don't get labelled with that. Doing it as a living is the.
I've seen some diabolical stuff, but I've never chased up the previous advisor on it.
Yeah, there used to be a lot of debate as to whether it's moral or not. But the reality is the FOS will look at it for free, and that's one of the advantages of using an IFA. It's the activity is pretty much underwritten. In fact, you could argue that the loss in the stock market is underwritten on a pension transfer, to that type of activity. Does anyone else want to come in, or there's an awful lot of people on mute, I must say. So anyone else wants to ask, by all means do so.
They're all at the back of the class.
Otherwise, back of the bus. Otherwise, they're all. Otherwise, we can wind it up. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything else to add.
Okay, it's been very, very useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie.
Okay, all right. Well, have a good day, everybody, and well done for turning up. And like I say, go to the relevant place. I don't think I can end the meeting, by the way. I can end my own participation in the meeting, but I can't end the meeting. So you'll all have to sign off one by one.
Okay, bye for now.
Cheers.
Okay, thanks. Bye.